Black, scorched ash swirled slowly in the still, thick air, settling on the shoulders of two figures trudging through the skeletons of what was once a city. 9 days. 9 circles of hell they had walked through together, leaving behind their names, their ranks, and their flags. Now they were just two shadows in a world of shadows. One was an American, Lieutenant Jack Baker, whose uniform hung from him in tatters, his once blue eyes faded to the color of ash. The other was a Japanese man, Sergeant Kenji Ishihara, his face an impenetrable mask hiding the storm that raged in his soul. His rifle, the symbol of his power and his hatred, was now just a stick he leaned on. They supported each other, the hand of an enemy on the shoulder of an enemy. Their silence was louder than any scream, for it echoed with the crash of a fallen world. Between them, holding their calloused hands, walked a little girl, about 5 years old, with empty, unseeing eyes. She was their anchor, their last thread connecting them to humanity. It was said that in those days in Hiroshima, the living envied the dead. But these three walked on. They didn't know where. They didn't know why. They just walked. Because to stop meant to die. Jack Baker looked at Ishihara. The Japanese man's gaze was fixed ahead, into the milky haze that hid the horizon. In his eyes, the American no longer saw hatred. He saw what he himself felt, an endless, all-consuming exhaustion. An exhaustion with life, with death, with himself. How had they come to this? How had the barbed wire that separated them turned into an invisible chain that bound them together? To understand that, one must go back 9 days, to the morning of August 6th, 1945, to the moment when their world still existed, and hatred was the only language they knew how to speak. The morning of August 6th, 1945, in the prison camp on the outskirts of Hiroshima began like hundreds of others before it, with a suffocating, humid heat that seeped under the skin before dawn, and the incessant, monotonous chirping of cicadas, like the sound of a string stretched to its breaking point. The air was thick and heavy, like a wet blanket smelling of dust, filth, and stale despair. For Lieutenant Jack Baker, the pilot of a downed B-29, this sound and this smell were the soundtrack to his personal hell. For more than a year he had been here, in this wooden barrack where time was measured not in hours, but in the changing of the guards and the empty bowls of thin gruel. His body had grown gaunt, his uniform had turned to rags, and in his soul, a scorched desert had replaced the former confidence of an American airman. But a spark of defiance still burned in his eyes. This spark was his only weapon, and he aimed it at one man, Sergeant Kenji Ishihara. Ishihara was the embodiment of everything Baker hated. Short, wiry, with a face that seemed carved from old wood, and eyes that held a cold, contemptuous fire. He moved with a measured, predatory grace, and his every step, every gesture, was steeped in the ideology that had turned an ordinary man into a ruthless machine of war. He didn't just guard the prisoners. He savored his power over them, over these tall, blonde barbarians who dared to defile the sacred soil of Japan. Their hatred was almost tangible. It hung in the air between them, thick and sticky like the summer heat. Every morning Ishihara conducted roll call, and his gaze always lingered on Baker a little longer than on the others. He pronounced his surname with a special, drawn-out contempt, as if tasting something foul. Baker would answer him with a direct, challenging stare. This was their silent jewel, their daily ritual. On that day, Ishihara was particularly cruel. During the morning inspection, he took issue with a button on Baker's threadbare shirt. It was just a pretext. He forced the American to stand under the scorching sun while the other prisoners worked. An hour. 2. Sweat poured into his eyes. The world swam before him. But Baker stood. He would not give the Japanese man the satisfaction of seeing him broken. He thought of home, of his wife, of the smell of freshly cut grass in Ohio. These thoughts were his armor. Ishihara watched him from the shade. Two feelings warring within his soul, triumph and a strange, dull irritation. He wanted to break this American, wanted to see fear, a plea in his eyes. But all he saw was stubbornness. It infuriated him. In his worldview, an enemy should be either dead or humiliated. There was no third option. He approached Baker, holding a cup of water. Slowly, savoring the moment, he poured the water onto the scorching earth at the American's feet. The water hissed and evaporated instantly. "So will your empire," Baker whispered in English. Ishihara didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He struck Baker in the stomach with the butt of his rifle. The American doubled over, gasping for air, but made no sound. Their eyes met. The hatred reached its peak. It was so pure and concentrated that it seemed it would materialize and incinerate them both. At that very moment, as their worlds narrowed to a single point of mutual loathing, something happened that was beyond their comprehension. The world vanished. It all began with silence. An unnatural, absolute silence. When even the cicadas, those eternal companions of the Japanese summer, suddenly fell quiet, as if they sensed something terrible. For one infinite moment, everything froze. Time, the air, the very beat of the heart. And then came the light. It was not sunlight. It was a light with no equivalent in human experience. White, blinding, all-consuming. It didn't come from somewhere in the sky. It was born right here, inside the head, in every cell of the body. Jack Baker, still bent over from the blow, only had time to lift his eyes. He saw the face of his enemy, Kenji Ishihara, turn completely white for a split second, like a porcelain mask, and in his dilated pupils, the apocalypse was reflected. The shadow of the sergeant's body on the parched earth became coal black, unnaturally sharp, as if seared onto the surface of the world. It was the last thing he remembered before the world exploded. The shockwave came later, an eternity that lasted no more than 2 seconds. First came the sound. A low, deep, growing rumble that came not from any specific direction, but from everywhere at once. From under the ground, from the sky, from the air itself. It was like the roar of a giant awakened beast. The wooden barracks of the prison creaked and groaned like the deck of a sinking ship. Then the wave hit. It was an invisible wall of compressed air, possessing the force of 100 hurricanes. It tore off the roofs with ease, as if they were sheets of paper, and scattered the walls, turning them into splinters. Baker was thrown into the air like a rag doll. He felt his body hit something hard, and darkness swallowed him. Ishihara, standing closer to the epicenter, took the full force of the blast. He saw his soldiers, the watchtower, the barbed wire, everything that constituted his small, orderly world, simply cease to exist, swept away by an invisible force. He was thrown backward onto the rubble of what had been the wall of his office a second ago. His rifle flew from his hands. A ringing in his ears was so loud it felt as if his head would burst. When he came to, the world had changed. The sky, clear and blue just a minute ago, was now shrouded in a crimson-black veil. The air was filled with dust, ash, and a strange metallic smell of ozone. Chaos reigned. The groans of the wounded mixed with the crackle of burning debris. Ishihara tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. His head was spinning. He was dazed, disoriented. A soldier's instincts demanded he find his weapon, take a defensive position, assess the situation. But who was there to fight? What was there to assess? Everything he knew, everything he believed in, had been annihilated in an instant. He looked around, trying to find something familiar, and his gaze fell upon the body of the American, lying nearby, pinned by a massive beam. Baker was unconscious, but he was breathing. Ishihara looked at him, and for the first time in many months he felt no hatred. He felt nothing. Emptiness. An emptiness as scorched as the earth around him. He slowly began to crawl out from under the wreckage, leaving his enemy to die. Every man for himself. That was the law of war. After pulling himself into an open space, he froze. Before him lay a world that should not exist. The city was gone. In its place Smoldering ruins stretched to the horizon. Solitary blackened skeletons of buildings stuck out of the ground like tombstones in a giant cemetery. It was a landscape from another planet. A landscape from hell. And then he understood. This was no ordinary bomb. This was something else. Something that had changed the rules. He heard a faint groan from beneath the rubble. The American. Ishihara froze for a moment, torn between two impulses. Leave. Leave him. He is the enemy. But something stopped him. In this new, monstrous world, the enemy was the only living person he could see. With a heavy sigh, cursing his own weakness, he turned back. He didn't know it yet, but this step would be his point of no return, the end of his former life, and the beginning of a new, terrifying, and strange odyssey. The first few hours after the blast were like a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake. The air, thick with dust and ash, burned the lungs. The sun, hidden behind a sinister, swirling cloud, had turned into a dull, crimson disk that barely illuminated the scene of total destruction. The silence that followed the roar was even more terrifying. It was the silence of death, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the occasional faint groans coming from under the ruins. Kenji Ishihara, with great effort, pushed aside a fragment of a beam and pulled Jack Baker out from under the debris. The American was unconscious, a bleeding wound on his head. Ishihara paused for a moment, looking at the helpless body of his enemy. A part of him, the one raised on the code of Bushido and loyalty to the Emperor, screamed, "Finish him! It is your duty." But another part, a primal human part, saw not an enemy, but simply another survivor in this hell. He tore a piece from his tunic and clumsily, roughly bandaged the American's head. Why had he done it? He couldn't answer that question himself. Perhaps it was instinct. Or maybe, in this shattered world, the old rules had lost their power. After some time, Baker regained consciousness. The first thing he saw was Ishihara's face leaning over him. He instinctively recoiled, trying to crawl away, the old hatred and fear flashing in his eyes. He expected a blow, the final, fatal one. But Ishihara just looked at him with his inscrutable eyes, then gestured with his chin toward what used to be the city. Baker followed his gaze and froze. The shock of what he saw was stronger than the pain and hatred. He had seen bombed-out cities in Europe, but this was something else. This was complete, absolute annihilation, as if God himself had swept his fiery hand across the land, erasing everything man had created. They sat like that for some time, two enemies amidst the ruins of their worlds, unable to utter a word. The language of hatred they had spoken for so long was useless in the face of this catastrophe. Finally, Ishihara stood up. He found his rifle, bent but intact, and leaned on it like a staff. He gave Baker a short glance and walked away, eastward, toward the mountains visible on the horizon. Baker watched him go. He too tried to stand. His head spun, his legs felt like cotton. He was free. His jailer was gone. He could go in any direction. But where? A scorched desert stretched for miles around him. He was alone, wounded, without water or food, in the heart of an enemy country that had just experienced an apocalypse. He trudged in the opposite direction to the west, toward where he calculated the port should be. Perhaps he would find help there. But after an hour of aimless wandering through the hot ash, among charred corpses and melted stones, he realized the futility of his efforts. He didn't know the terrain. He didn't know where to look for water. The sun, though dim, baked him mercilessly, and thirst was becoming unbearable. Despair began to gnaw at his will. Suddenly he saw Ishihara's figure in the distance. The Japanese man had also stopped. He was standing motionless, looking at the ruins. He seemed to be at a loss as well. And then Baker understood a simple, terrifying thing. They would not survive alone. Everything divided them. Language, culture, ideology, war. But one thing united them. They were both here, at the epicenter of the world's end, and they both wanted to live. Swallowing the bitter saliva of pride, Baker changed direction and slowly trudged toward Ishihara. The Japanese man noticed him approaching. He raised his rifle, but there was no threat in his gesture, more like caution. When Baker drew near, he stopped a few steps away. They looked at each other. The silence was tense. Finally, Baker did something that would have seemed unthinkable to him just hours before. He raised his hand and pointed to the sun, then to his own shadow, and then drew an imaginary line to the north. He was trying to show that he knew how to navigate. Then he pointed to his parched lips and made a gesture mimicking drinking. Ishihara looked at him for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he slowly lowered his rifle. He understood. This barbarian, this enemy, possessed knowledge that he did not. And he, Ishihara, knew this land. He knew where wells and streams used to be. He nodded. A single sharp nod. It was not a sign of friendship. It was a contract. A forced, desperate alliance forged in the heart of hell. Ishihara turned and started walking, but not as fast this time. He waited for the American to catch up. They walked together, shoulder to shoulder, two former enemies bound by a single goal: to survive. Their path led them through the ruins, and on this path, they saw things that would forever remain in their memories. They saw people with burned skin hanging in strips, silently wandering to nowhere. They heard a child's cry coming from beneath the rubble. Ishihara wanted to walk past. They couldn't stop. They had to find water. But Baker stopped. He began to clear the debris. Ishihara watched him with irritation, but then, not understanding why, he joined in. Under the rubble, they found a little girl, about 5 years old. She was covered in dust, but unharmed. She looked at them with huge frightened eyes and did not cry. She just stared silently. Baker held out his hand to her. She flinched. Then Ishihara knelt down and said something quietly to her in Japanese. His voice was unusually soft. The girl came to him and clung to his pant leg. This child, this small, fragile life, became something more to them than just a rescued person. She became their shared point of humanity. She was what they both, the American and the Japanese fathers who had left their own families thousands of miles away, instinctively wanted to protect. They picked her up. Now there were 3 of them. Their strange, impossible party moved on, in search of life amidst the kingdom of death. The first victory in their desperate fight for life was small, almost unnoticeable, but to them, it meant everything. It was a victory over thirst. After several hours of agonizing wandering across the scorched plain, when their tongues stuck to the roofs of their mouths and their vision blurred, Ishihara stopped. He pointed to a small hollow where, among the blackened stones, the remains of an old stone well were visible. It was almost a miracle. Baker, despite his weakness, rushed forward, but Ishihara stopped him with a sharp gesture. The Japanese man approached the well first. He stared for a long time at the dark, foul-smelling water at the bottom. Then he scooped some into his helmet and brought it to his face, but did not drink. He inhaled the scent. Baker was burning with impatience. What was he doing? Why the delay? But Ishihara acted with the methodicalness of a man whose life depended on this decision. He understood what the American did not. In this new world, water could be as deadly an enemy as fire. It could be poisoned. Finally, he seemed to have made a decision. He took a tiny sip and stood motionless for several minutes, listening to his body. Then he nodded. It was safe. Baker, forgetting everything, fell to the edge of the well. He drank for a long time, greedily, and it was the most delicious water of his life. It tasted of ash and death, but it was wet. It was cool. It was life. They gave water to the girl, Akiko, as Ishihara called her. She drank in small, frightened sips. When they had quenched their thirst, a terrible exhaustion washed over them. They took shelter in the shadow of a ruined wall, the only shade for many meters around. The girl fell asleep, nestled against Ishihara. Baker watched them. This cruel jailer who now so gently shielded a sleeping child from the dim, poisonous sun. The world had turned upside down. Everything that had seemed unshakable, enemy, friend, hatred, duty, had all crumbled to dust just like the city around them. Their first night together was a trial. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The cold chilled them to the bone. They huddled together for warmth. An American, a Japanese man, and a little Japanese girl. 3 living beings united by a primal fear of the dark and the cold. Baker didn't sleep. He looked at the stars, which seemed unnaturally bright in the black sky, unpolluted by the city's light. He thought about how paradoxical life was. Just yesterday, he had dreamed of killing the man who now slept beside him, warming him with his body. The war had brought them to the same point to destroy them, but instead, it had reforged them into something new, something incomprehensible. The next day, they continued their journey. Now they had a system. In the morning, while it wasn't so hot, they walked. Baker, using the sun and his shadow, determined the direction north toward the mountains where, according to Ishihara, there should be villages untouched by the blast. Ishihara, in turn, was their guide in this world of ruins. He found the remnants of roads, determined where water sources might be, and read signs invisible to the American. He found food where it seemed nothing living remained. Charred but edible root vegetables in former gardens, canned goods in collapsed cellars. It was meager sustenance, but it kept them alive. Akiko became the center of their small universe. Caring for her gave their existence meaning. They took turns carrying her when she grew tired. They gave her the best pieces of food. Baker made her a doll from rags and a stick. Ishihara told her stories in a quiet, monotonous voice. They barely spoke to each other. The language barrier was almost insurmountable. But gradually their own language began to emerge between them. A language of gestures, glances, short sounds. A gesture that meant water. A look that said danger. A nod confirming, I understand. This primitive language was more honest and understandable than all the words they had spoken to each other before. One day they stumbled upon the ruins of a Buddhist temple. Among the scorched statues and shattered bells, they found a small pond with goldfish. The fish were alive. In this kingdom of death, these small, bright creatures seemed like messengers from another world. For the first time in all these days, Akiko smiled. She sat on the edge of the pond, watching the fish, her face illuminated with a quiet, childish delight. Baker and Ishihara stood nearby, silently watching her. And in that moment, they both felt the same thing. It wasn't hope. Hope had died with the city. It was something else. A quiet, fragile feeling, like a sprout breaking through asphalt. The feeling that as long as they were together, as long as they could protect this little smile, they were still human. Their first victory over thirst gave them life, but this little smile gave them something more. It gave them a reason to live. They did not yet know that the hostile environment they were learning to conquer was preparing a new, far more terrible trial for them. Their fragile, orderly world, built on the ruins of civilization, began to acquire its own laws and rituals. Each day was like the last, consisting of simple, vital tasks. Find water, find food, walk a little further north, protect Akiko. They had become a small, primitive tribe of 3. There was no single leader in this tribe. Leadership was situational, shifting. When it was necessary to determine direction or figure out how to pry open a jammed cellar door, Baker, with his American ingenuity and engineering skills acquired before the war, took charge. He could make a hook from a piece of wire, a lever from a fragment of pipe. He was a master of creating order from chaos. But when it came to surviving in this new, hostile environment, Ishihara was in command. Having grown up in a village, he possessed knowledge that proved priceless. He could tell by the color of the leaves on a surviving tree whether groundwater was near. He knew which mushrooms growing on charred trunks were edible and which were deadly poisonous. He taught Baker to walk almost silently, stepping on certain parts of his feet so as not to attract attention. What kind of attention? Baker didn't understand at first, but he would soon find out. Their little empire of 3 gave them not only physical resources, but also psychological stability. The daily routine, the clear division of roles, the common goal. All this was the straw their minds clung to, trying not to drown in the abyss of madness. In the evenings, when they settled for the night in some surviving cellar or under a shelter of debris, it was Akiko's time. She was the keeper of their humanity. Baker, remembering his childhood, would create a shadow puppet theater on the wall, using the flame of a small fire. His fingers formed figures of dogs, birds, rabbits. Akiko watched with apprehension at first, but then she began to laugh, a quiet, silvery laugh. That laugh was their greatest reward. Seeing this, Ishihara changed too. The stern mask on his face would sometimes crack, and something warm, almost fatherly, would appear in his eyes. One evening, he took a small, battered notebook and a pencil from his satchel. He began to draw. He drew pictures for Akiko, Mount Fuji, cherry blossoms, koi fish. His drawings were simple but full of the life that was so lacking in their world. This is how they lived. They created their own civilization on the bones of the old one. A civilization based not on hatred and orders, but on interdependence and silent understanding. They were still enemies on paper, by uniform, by language. But here, in this hell, these concepts had lost all meaning. They were just Jack, Kenji, and Akiko. Their fragile stability and growing unity seemed like a reliable armor. But they had overlooked one thing. There were other survivors in this ruined world, and not all of them had managed to retain their human form. Their idol, if one could call their existence that, collapsed on the 7th day. They found a large, almost undamaged warehouse full of canned goods. It was an incredible stroke of luck, one that could provide them with food for many days to come. Their joy was short-lived. As they were about to leave, laden with their precious bounty, they emerged from the shadows. There were 5 of them. They were Japanese soldiers. But there was nothing of the Imperial Army in their appearance. Their uniforms were torn and burned. The skin on their faces and hands was covered in terrible sores and burns. But the most terrifying thing was their eyes. Empty, insane, burning with a hungry, inhuman fire. These were men driven to the brink by pain, hunger, and radiation sickness. They saw Baker, and in their eyes, recognition and a wild, irrational hatred flared. In their clouded minds, this American was the cause of all their suffering. He was the enemy. He was the one responsible for the apocalypse. One of them, apparently an officer, shouted something guttural and pointed at Baker. Slowly, like a pack of wolves, the soldiers began to encircle them. Their idyllic little world was crumbling. In the darkness of their small empire, it was not just a rebellion that was brewing. A hunt had begun. The moment the 5 maddened soldiers began to tighten the circle, time slowed down for Jack Baker and Kenji Ishihara. Every sound, every rustle echoed in their ears with deafening clarity. Baker instinctively pushed Akiko behind him, trying to shield her with his body, and took a step back toward Ishihara. He expected that his companion, his forced ally, would now make a choice. After all, these were his own people, soldiers of his army, his nation, and next to him stood the enemy. The logic of war was simple and merciless. Ishihara had to either step aside or join them. There would have been nothing surprising in that. It would have been the right thing to do, from the perspective of the world that had collapsed 7 days ago. Ishihara stood motionless, his face a stone mask. He looked at the approaching soldiers, at their burned faces, at the madness in their eyes. He did not see compatriots in them. He saw a reflection of what he himself could have become if he had succumbed to despair and hatred. He saw in them the ghosts of the war he had fought his entire adult life, a war that had burned his city and his soul. The officer, staggering, came closer. He was saying something to Ishihara, pointing at Baker. His voice was hoarse, full of pain and rage. He spoke of duty, of honor, of revenge for fallen comrades. He urged Ishihara to fulfill his duty and kill the enemy. All these words, which just a week ago had been sacred to Ishihara, now sounded like empty, meaningless noise. Duty? To whom? To an empire that could not protect its own children? Honor? What honor could there be in killing an unarmed man in front of a frightened child? Revenge? Revenge on whom? On this American, who for the last 7 days had shared his last sip of water with him and carried a crying girl in his arms? The internal conflict that had been smoldering in his soul all these days flared up with new force. One part of him, Sergeant Kenji Ishihara of the Imperial Army, demanded obedience. But the other, simply a man, a father, and a husband named Kenji, looked at little Akiko, who was clinging to his pant leg, and understood that he could not do it. He could not let this madness touch her. He made his choice. When one of the soldiers brandishing a piece of rebar lunged at Baker, Ishihara stepped forward and thrust his rifle out, blocking the blow. He said nothing. He simply stood between the American and his former comrades. This gesture was more eloquent than any words. The officer froze in astonishment, and then his face contorted with rage. Traitor. He screamed the word, and it held all his contempt. To him, Ishihara protecting the enemy was worse than the enemy himself. He had become a traitor to his race, his nation, his blood. The soldiers, spurred on by their commander's fury, rushed at them. A fight began. It was not a battle. It was a desperate animalistic brawl for survival. Baker, using his physical strength, threw one of the attackers aside. Ishihara acted with cold, calculated precision. He did not try to kill. He struck with the rifle butt at their arms, their legs, disarming them, disabling them. He still saw them as people, albeit people who had lost their minds. He was not just protecting the American, he was protecting his own last island of humanity. He was defending his right not to become a beast like them. The internal enemy, the ghost of his past, was almost defeated. He had made his choice, ceasing to be a soldier of the Empire and becoming simply a man. But while they were fending off the crazed soldiers, they did not notice that their real, impersonal enemy, radiation, the invisible death dissolved in the air, was delivering its blow. Akiko, who had been standing behind them the whole time, suddenly gave a small cry and collapsed to the ground. The fight was short and fierce. Baker and Ishihara, acting as a single coordinated unit, repelled the attack. They killed none of the attackers. The exhausted, wounded soldiers, having met unexpected and desperate resistance, retreated and vanished into the shadows of the ruins, taking their madness and pain with them. Silence fell, broken only by the heavy breathing of the two men. And in that silence they heard a faint moan. Akiko. The girl lay on the ground, her face pale, blood trickling from her lips. She had not been injured in the fight. It was something else, something internal, invisible, and terrifying. It was radiation sickness. For all these days, they had been breathing poisoned air, drinking poisoned water, eating food grown in poisoned earth. Their adult, strong bodies were still coping, but a fragile child system could not withstand it. In that moment, the ultimate trial began for Baker and Ishihara. The fight with the mad soldiers had been a battle with the past. Now they faced a battle with the abyss, with an invisible, all-pervading enemy that could not be punched or shot. They carried Akiko to shelter. She was burning with fever, sometimes delirious, calling for her mother. They did everything they could. They bathed her forehead with cool water, tried to feed her broth from canned goods. Baker, remembering first aid courses, tried to find her pulse, listened to her breathing. Ishihara sat beside her, holding her small hand in his large calloused ones, and whispered something quietly to her in Japanese. They were not fairy tales. They were prayers. All their skills, all their unexpected weapons that had helped them survive until now. Baker's ability to navigate, Ishihara's knowledge of the terrain, all of it was useless in the face of this new threat. They were powerless. The despair they had held at bay for so long began to flood them. They watched this little life they had sworn to protect fade away, and they felt their own guilt. They should have left this cursed city sooner. They should have found help. At night, Akiko grew worse. Her breathing became shallow. She no longer recognized them. Ishihara, seeing that the girl was dying, made a desperate decision. He had heard from other survivors that there was a monastery in the mountains, a few days' journey away, where monks cared for the sick and wounded. Perhaps there was a doctor there. Perhaps there was medicine. It was a faint, almost insane hope, but it was the only hope they had left. He explained his plan to Baker using gestures and drawings in the sand. Baker understood. The risk was enormous. The girl might not survive the journey, but to stay here meant certain death. They prepared to leave. Ishihara fashioned a makeshift stretcher from 2 poles and a piece of canvas. He gently laid Akiko on it. He wanted to carry her himself, but Baker stopped him. He took one end of the stretcher, showing that they would carry her together. This was their last desperate push, their battle with the abyss. They walked all night without rest, under the unnaturally bright stars. They walked, supporting each other, protecting their precious, fading cargo. They were no longer an American and a Japanese. They were just 2 fathers trying to save a child. Their own pain, fatigue, wounds, all of it faded into the background. There was only one goal: to get there. At dawn, as they staggered with exhaustion to the top of another hill, they saw something ahead that made them freeze. It was not a monastery. In the distance, in the morning haze, they saw a convoy of military trucks, and flying from them was a flag, the stars and stripes of the United States of America. Salvation. It had come at the moment they had stopped waiting for it, but the cry that burst from Baker's chest was not a cry of joy. It was a cry in which relief and terror were mixed. Relief for himself and Akiko, and terror for the man who stood beside him. The euphoria of rescue was as blinding and brief as the flash that had destroyed the city. The American soldiers, young, healthy, clean, in new, pristine uniforms, looked at them as if they were ghosts. They stared at the gaunt, bearded Baker, at his Japanese companion with the rifle, and at the little girl on the makeshift stretcher. First there was disbelief, then surprise, and then a barrage of questions. Baker, as an American officer, was immediately surrounded with care. He was given water from a canteen, a chocolate bar, a cigarette. A medic examined his wounds. Akiko was also attended to immediately. She was carefully transferred to a real stretcher and carried to a medical truck. The doctors shook their heads but promised to do everything possible. And Ishihara just stood aside. To the American soldiers, he was just another Japanese soldier. An enemy. 2 Marines approached him, unceremoniously ripped the rifle from his hands and roughly forced his arms behind his back. Baker saw this and rushed toward them. "Stop!" he yelled. "You don't understand. He saved my life!" The soldiers looked at him in confusion. The officer in charge of the patrol approached Baker. "Lieutenant, calm down. We'll sort this out. For now, this man is a prisoner of war." "He's not just a prisoner," Baker tried to explain, his voice breaking. "We went through hell together. He protected me. We saved this girl together." He spoke quickly, disjointedly, trying to cram the entire 9-day odyssey, the whole complex gamut of their relationship born in the nuclear ash, into a few sentences. But the officer looked at him with cold, tired eyes. He saw a shell-shocked, exhausted man who had possibly lost his mind from the ordeal. He saw an American hero and a Japanese enemy. It was all simple, black and white. No shades of gray. "We appreciate your information, Lieutenant. It will all be recorded in the report. Now you need to rest. You'll be sent to the hospital." Ishihara was led away. He did not resist. He walked with his head held high, his face once again an impenetrable mask. Before they pushed him into the truck for prisoners, he turned and looked at Baker. There was no resentment in his gaze, No reproach, only a quiet, bitter acknowledgement of fact. Their world, the world where they were just Jack and Kenji, had collapsed the moment they were found. The civilization they had so eagerly awaited had returned them to their old roles, their old hatred. The cold reality of the victorious world had severed the bond born in the hell of Hiroshima. Baker was sent to a hospital in Okinawa. He was treated, fed, and debriefed. He told his story again and again. He told of Sergeant Ishihara's cruelty in the camp, and of his courage in the ruined city. He told of how the Japanese man had protected him from his own soldiers, risking his own life. He told of little Akiko, but no one listened. Or rather, they listened, but they did not hear. The part of his story about the heroism of the American pilot who survived a nuclear blast formed the basis of newspaper articles and reports. But the other part, the one about the good Japanese, was dismissed as delirium, as Stockholm Syndrome, as a consequence of severe shell shock. For the war machine, for propaganda, for the entire world that had just ended the most terrible war in history, there could be no good enemies. An enemy had to remain an enemy. The story of their brotherhood was too inconvenient, too complex, too human. The system delivered its verdict. Lieutenant Jack Baker was a hero. Sergeant Kenji Ishihara was prisoner of war number 731. Their heroic deed was buried under tons of paper reports and ideological cliches. Fate, which had so bizarrely brought two enemies together at the epicenter of the apocalypse, just as ruthlessly and mundanely cast them to different corners of the new, post-war world. For Jack Baker, returning home was not a happy ending. He was celebrated as a hero. Newspapers wrote about the unbroken pilot of Hiroshima. He was awarded medals, invited to receptions, but he felt like a stranger at this celebration of life. He returned to his quiet town in Ohio to his wife, to a peaceful job. But the hell he had been through would not let him go. At night, he didn't dream of the horrors of war. Not the explosion, not the ruins. He dreamed of a silent Japanese man and a little girl with huge, sad eyes. He tried to move on, but the shadow of Hiroshima lay heavy on his soul. He would often sit on his porch, watching the sunset, and think of Kenji. What had become of him? Where was he? Was he even alive? He wrote inquiries to military archives trying to find any information about prisoner of war number 731, but all he received in return were dry, formal rejections. The system that had separated them guarded its secrets well. He never found out that Akiko, the girl they had saved, died 2 days later in an American hospital from acute radiation sickness. The doctors did everything they could, but her small body had been irreversibly poisoned by radiation. Her name was added to the endless lists of Hiroshima's victims. Even less is known about the fate of Kenji Ishihara. He, like thousands of other Japanese soldiers, was sent to a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. There, in the tropical heat, disease, and meager rations, few survived. He never told anyone what had happened to him in the ruined city. Who would have believed him? To his countrymen, he would have been a traitor who protected the enemy. To the Americans, he was just a prisoner. His story was too personal, too incredible to be put into words. It belonged only to him and to the American whose face he sometimes saw in his dreams. He remained in the camp for 2 years. What happened to him after that is unknown. Perhaps he returned to Japan and tried to find his family. Perhaps he could not endure the hardships of captivity and died of disease or exhaustion. His trail was lost in the chaos of the post-war era. Jack Baker lived a long but quiet and sad life. He never flew again. He rarely smiled and spoke to almost no one about the war. To others he was a hero, but he did not consider himself one. He knew that the true feat performed there in the ruins of Hiroshima was not his alone. It was their shared feat. The feat of two enemies who managed to remain human. He died in 1985 from cancer. The doctors said it might have been a long-term effect of the radiation exposure. Before his death, when he was already unconscious, he kept repeating two names, Kenji, Akiko. His family did not know who they were. They thought it was just deathbed delirium. And so this story ended. The story of how the atomic bomb, created for total annihilation, paradoxically destroyed the hatred between two men. Their brotherhood, born in hell, was forgotten by the world, but it remained forever in their hearts. He was buried in a small cemetery with military honors, but it was said that every year on the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, on August 6th, someone would leave a single small paper crane, a Japanese symbol of hope and peace, on his grave. Who did it, and how the crane got there from distant Japan, no one ever knew. The official history of war is a chronicle of battles, the names of generals, and the dates treaties were signed. It is written in ink on paper and stored in dusty archives. But there is another history. The one written in scars on the heart, the one passed in whispers from one soldier to another, the one that lives on in soldiers' tales and urban legends. The story of Jack Baker and Kenji Ishihara did not make it into the history books. Their names are not carved on memorials. The system they both defended and fought against deemed their story too inconvenient, too wrong. It was buried alive, like thousands of Hiroshima's victims, but it did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend. Among American veterans who served in the occupation forces in Japan, there was a belief about a ghostly patrol. It was said that on the anniversary of the bombing, in the pre-dawn fog, one could sometimes see three figures in the ruins of the old prison. A tall American, a short Japanese soldier with a rifle for a staff, and a little girl they held by the hands. They walked silently through the ruins, eternal prisoners of that terrible day, searching for either salvation or peace. In Hiroshima itself, among the stories of survivors, there's a legend of two demons, two oni, who emerged from the fire. One was called Wrath, the other Compassion. It was said they were enemies, but the nuclear fire fused them together, and they walked through the ruined city, delivering their own judgment, punishing looters, and saving the innocent. And they were led by the soul of an innocent child. Of course, these are just legends, myths born of pain and shock. But in every myth, there's a kernel of truth. This story is not just a chronicle of survival, it is a parable. A parable about how the strongest walls, ideological, national, racial, crumble in the face of a true, universal catastrophe. It is about how, when civilization turns to ash, the only thing that matters is not the color of the flag on your uniform, but the ability to see in the eyes of your enemy a human being, just like you. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? Was there any meaning in their forgotten feat? There's no answer to that question. But perhaps the very fact that in the heart of a hell created by men to destroy other men, two mortal enemies were able to extend their hands to one another. Perhaps that is the answer. That is the small, fragile victory of humanity over the madness of war. A victory that will not be written about in reports, but one that will forever remain in the eternal chronicle of the human spirit.